Hi, this is Maria Williams. In this video, I'm going to show you how I made these 3 cards. I took a panel of vellum, white embossed snowflakes on one side, and then colored them in with markers on the reverse side. It's really an easy technique. I'm starting out with a thick white cardstock card base that is 8.5 by 5.5, scored at 4 1/4, so I end up with a standard A2 size card. And then I have my panels. The Pacific Point panel is a 1/4 inch smaller than the finished card, and each other panel is a 1/4 inch smaller than that. I'll have the dimensions for you. And I'm starting out with the Whisper White panel first. I'm going to take some Tempting Turquoise ink and I'm going to sponge it all over the panel. I'm dipping my sponge into the ink and then I'm tapping off the excess onto my grid paper and then coming onto the piece of cardstock from the side. This will achieve 2 things. 1, I won't get any blobs in the middle of my panel, and 2, because the sponge kind of catches a little bit on the edge of the cardstock, I will get a nice defined edge all the way around. I'm using a light touch and I'm working mainly in a circular motion to make sure that the ink is distributed as evenly as possible. But I'm not really trying to get the panel to be one solid color. I do want some variation. I want it to look almost like clouds so that when I put the vellum panel on top, I can still see a little bit of variation in the color. If I wanted the panel to be just a solid color, I probably would have just used a panel of soft sky or one of the lighter shades of blue. To test out the color and make sure it's as dark as I would like it to be, I'm taking my piece of vellum and placing it on top of the panel and making sure I like the way the color shows through. It looks a little bit light, so I'm going to add just a little bit more color and then move on with the card. I'm getting my piece of vellum ready for embossing by prepping it with my embossing buddy, making sure that I have plenty of powder since the vellum can be pretty staticky. And then I'm taking some Versamark ink and I'm going to stamp the larger 2 snowflakes from the Flurry of Wishes stamp set. I'm starting out with the largest snowflake in the lower left corner, and then I will stamp the smaller snowflake to the right of this one that I just stamped and also right above it. And if you notice, when I'm stamping with large stamps, I like to lay the stamp flat on my surface and tap the ink pad onto it rather than inking up the stamp by tapping it onto the ink pad. I just find it a little bit easier. So I've gone ahead and stamped the large one, and now I'm going to ink up the smaller one and stamp it twice. If you were really having trouble seeing your stamped images, what you could do at this point, since the snowflakes are not overlapping, is to stamp one snowflake and then put your embossing powder on it so you could see it, and then stamp the other 2 and then add the embossing powder. So once I've got all my snowflakes stamped, I'm just getting my white embossing powder and sprinkling it all over my images. And then I'm going to let my embossing tool heat up really well, and then I'm going to heat emboss the snowflakes. Another thing that I like to do to keep my paper from warping is to place it in a flat pan. This one's just from a toaster oven. I've just covered it in foil. I'll probably never use it again to cook anything, but I do like to use something like this. You could use, of course, any size pan, but I do recommend that you line it in foil, and then you can put your pieces of paper in there, and it just keeps them from warping as much. My vellum panel has now had a chance to cool down, so I have flipped it over in preparation for coloring, and I'm just using 2 of the Bright's Stamping Right markers. I'm going to use the Pacific Point and also the Tempting Turquoise. And even though the spaces I'm going to be coloring are fairly small, I am going to use the brush tip end. I'm starting out with Pacific Point, and all I'm doing is selecting whatever areas I think will look good in the darker shade and making sure that I am coloring all those areas. I do like it to be kind of symmetrical, so I'm going to color every area that is of that size with that particular color. And every once in a while I'm going to flip it over and make sure that it looks okay. And if you notice, I'm not being really careful to stay within the lines because that white embossing powder is totally opaque. And so wherever you're going over the lines, as long as there's embossing powder there, you will not be able to see it on the other side. So even though it looks like I'm being kind of messy and that it's not going to look good, when I flip it over, you'll see that you really can't see those areas where I'm going outside the line. And then I'm moving on to my second color. I'm basically doing the same thing, just selecting some areas and roughly coloring everything in. I do want to make sure that I color in fairly solidly. I didn't do as good a job in the video as I did on the cards that I did previously. I was trying to work a little fast, so just make sure that the area is fairly well covered so that you don't have variations in the color, so that it's one solid color. If you don't own any of these markers, you could certainly use Copic markers, but just know that those colors, when you apply them to the vellum, lighten up a whole lot. So even though the cat might look really dark, it's not going to be as dark on the vellum. I think Copics are great, but for this particular application, I personally prefer the dye-based markers. So I'm just going to continue coloring until all the areas that I would like colored are all filled in. You definitely don't have to fill in every little tiny space. You can just fill in a few or fill in a lot, whatever looks good to you. I'm going to work on the sentiment now, and if you were making one of the cards with the silver embossed sentiment, you would just use 2 strips of paper, one in white and one in whatever pattern you would like, and emboss the sentiment and then glue those together. But I'm going to show you a different way of adding a sentiment, which is to just stamp it onto the vellum. And I'm not going to use Versamark. I'm not going to use a colored embossing powder for this. I'm just going to use the Pacific Point ink, which matches the marker that I used, and then I'm going to emboss it with clear embossing powder. So since my panel warped a little bit when I heat embossed it, I'm just using a couple small pieces of washi tape on the corners to make sure that it lays nice and flat while I stamp my sentiment. The sentiment I'm using is from the same Flurry of Wishes stamp set, and it says, "Sending you a flurry of warm Christmas wishes." I love that sentiment with the snowflakes. And now that I've stamped it, I'm going to carefully peel up the washi tape, add some clear embossing powder to the sentiment, let my heat tool heat up again, and then emboss the sentiment. I'm now going to start assembling the card. So I'm taking my Pacific Point panel and attaching it to the front of the card. I'm just doing this with some snail. And then I'm going to attach my vellum piece to the sponge piece using 2 different types of adhesive. For the centers of the snowflakes, I'm going to use glue dots. And for those that are where the whole center is on the panel, I can just use the glue dot as it is. But for this one, where there's only half of a center, I'm going ahead and rolling up the glue dot and then attaching it. This is a great way to have just a little teeny tiny bit of adhesive, is to just roll up the glue dot and it still stays really, really sticky. I'm going to add some of the multi-purpose glue to some of the letters. I'm just going to add a couple of little dots behind some of the larger letters, and you will not be able to see this through the vellum either. This is one of those situations where you want to use just little tiny dots. This is really good glue and it sticks really well, so don't use too much because then it'll smear and it could show through. So just really small dots. To embellish the card, I'm going to use some rhinestones. I'm going to use the larger ones from the variety pack. And then I'm also going to use some snowflakes, little snowflakes that I cut with a punch that I bought years ago. It's not a Stampin' Up! One. I'm not even sure what the brand is. And I'm once again going to use rolled up glue dots to attach these little snowflakes to the vellum. I'm going to finish off my card by applying some snail to the Pacific Point panel and attaching my vellum and sponge pieces to that. And technically my card is done. But there were a couple of areas that were lifting up more than I would have liked. And so I decided to apply a little bit more multi-purpose glue to one of the areas that was colored in Pacific Point, so I knew that that wouldn't really show through. And then for the upper right hand corner, I couldn't just apply any glue up there because I didn't have anywhere to hide it. So I decided to go ahead and punch one more snowflake and attach it up there. Unfortunately, there was some operator error with the camera, and I did not get footage of me doing that, but there are pictures of each individual card at the end of this video, so you can see exactly what the finished card looks like. I hope you enjoyed this video and maybe learned a new technique. Thanks so much for watching. If you would like to see more pictures or purchase any of the products used in this video, please visit my blog at mariascardsandmore.com. Thanks for watching.